So let's take a look at the materials that you're going to need if you want to paint in watercolor. The really good news is that there isn't a whole lot that you have to get. A handful of really good quality materials will get you started and actually will carry you an awfully long way. Everything that you need, and actually more than what you need, is here on my studio easel, and we're going to take a look at those one by one so that you can get a good handle on the kinds of things that you got to buy, particularly if you're just starting out. So let's take a look at all of this stuff. So if you're going to be painting, obviously you need paint, and that's what I have laid out here. There's 13 tubes of paint here that I recommend, particularly if you're just starting out. You can really start with a very limited number of colors, and these 13 will do you very, very well for a really long time as you're learning and progressing in your painting. I have really what amounts to a primary palette. I've got on it reds, yellows, blues, some earth tones, and a couple other colors that are pretty handy mixers. I also have one orange, which is a secondary color, but it becomes useful on this palette. I do recommend, now I've got a bunch of different looking tubes here, and that's because they're from different manufacturers. You can look on the link for this video, on the page for this video, there's a link to my suggested materials list. If you download that list, you'll get the exact color and the exact manufacturer that you want to be purchasing if you want to duplicate what I've got here. But I do have, again, 2 reds and I have 2 yellows. I actually have 4 blues. That's because when you're mixing particularly greens and some of the secondary violet colors, having a number of blues like this will actually serve you pretty well. And I have an orange, as I mentioned, a secondary orange, which is the only secondary color on the palette. I have these 2 colors, which are really terrific mixing colors, but they're both, this is quinacridone burnt scarlet by Daniel Smith, and it's actually a low intensity cool red but with some high chroma, and it's a really great mixer, as is this color, which is quinacridone deep gold, also by Daniel Smith, and it is a yellowish color, and again is a very terrific mixing color. Down here I have 2 earth colors. I've got burnt sienna and raw sienna, and again they come in very handy as colors that you'll use to mix with others to get a wider variety of colors and actually values and intensity in your painting. And again, the names of these colors and their manufacturer name is on the list that you can download from the link. So I suggest that you do that and you'll have exactly what you need. I will point out lastly that these are all professional grade colors. What that means is initially when you purchase the tubes of paint, they're going to be a little bit pricey, and it's sometimes hard to throw that money out there when you're initially buying materials, because as you're stocking up on all of those things, it can get a little bit pricey, and it makes you scared, but it's worthwhile. These colors will work better for you. You'll get used to what those professional grade colors look like, and you really won't want to work with anything else. The things that you can get that are even student grade colors are usually somewhat inferior because they're often mixes of things they're trying to duplicate. For instance, cerulean blue is a color that unfortunately the real cerulean is quite an expensive pigment, but all of the attempts to duplicate it using less expensive pigments just don't work out too well. So again, I do recommend you get professional grade colors, and if you want these exact ones, they're on the list that you can download from the link. So let's go to the next thing, which is your palette. And now once you have your paint, you have to have something to put the paint on. So this is where your palette will come in. This particular palette is a plastic one. It's actually made and sold by Cheap Joe's down in North Carolina. It's a very basic palette. It has a number of wells. It looks like I should have counted them and I didn't, but it looks like it's got about 17 wells on there. You can see they're not all full, but these are very big wells. As you can see, they're filled with paint, and what this has on it really are the colors that we just took a look at, with the exception that it's got one extra color on there, one that's not on the list and was not in that set of tubes that I showed you earlier. But other than that, these are all the same colors that I recommended a little earlier in the video. Get yourself a palette. It does not have to be this one, but a fairly large, something at least 9 by 12, maybe even bigger palette like this that also has a lid that you can put on top. This one's got a lid that I can cover it with. Here's the lid, a little bit dirty, but this lid goes on the top, clamps down, and it allows me to close it up if I want to take the palette either outdoors to paint or perhaps to a class or workshop. Keeps the paint intact, keeps things from running around too much. The other thing I'd say about the palette and the colors that you're putting on the palette is make sure you fill up those wells with paint. You can see these are all full. I've been using this one and my cobalt blue is a little bit low, so I'm going to put some in right now. And again, really fill up those wells. I mean, get that paint down in there. There we go. You'll want to have a lot of paint available to you when you're trying to get it out of the well to paint with, because you're also going to be using a lot of water. And using the water, you're going to find that you're going to use a lot of paint as well. So the next thing we're going to take a look at are the brushes that you'll need. And again, you only need a few handful, and let's take a look at those right now. Let's take a look at watercolor brushes. Now, if you go into a store or you go online to some catalog retailer or you look in a catalog from one of those retailers, you're going to see all kinds of brushes, and it's hard to know what to get. First thing to know is you don't need a whole lot of brushes. Really, there's a handful that will work for you. You're going to need, depending on what you eventually settle on that you like to paint with, you're going to need some round brushes like actually these three. Or you may find that you enjoy painting with flat brushes more, and you're going to need flat brushes. I have two of those here. And then I have this kind of specialty little brush it's called a rigger. It's a very thin brush, but it's got these long bristles on it. Flat brushes and round brushes work a little bit differently. They make kind of different marks, and what you choose to paint with really will depend ultimately on what works better for you, what kind of subject matter you're painting often, and frankly what you get used to painting with. But just in terms of the rounds, you're really going to want, and this is hard, most people buy very, very small brushes when they start out. You know, they're working with things that are small like this one, or perhaps here's something like this from my my brush stand over there on the easel. But you really want big brushes, so you're going to want one of these and one of these. If you look at the materials list that you can download from the link, you'll find some recommendations. Usually number 14 is going to be a number 14 round. They're from most manufacturers will be about the same size. Sometimes there's variation, but a number 14 round really has about 1.5 inches width right at the ferrule where the bristles come out of the brush. So about 1/4 inch there, and whatever size the manufacturer says that is. In this case, this is a low Cornell ultra round. They say that's a 14. So it may vary slightly, but just look for that, about 1/4 inch width right here at the ferrule where the bristles come out of the brush. And you're also going to want one of these. Now, this one is actually, this is a Cheap Joe's, a Joe Miller's Golden Fleece, he calls it. It's a nylon brush. Perfectly fine, works very well, but you can see it's about 1/2 inch wide here at the ferrule. Now Cheap Joe says this is a number 38. These larger round brushes, you're going to find pretty wide variation in what that number is. I have another one that's the same size, and that manufacturer says it's a number 18. So you really have to be careful about that number when you're picking brushes, but be more concerned again about this width right here at the ferrule, which is how wide is that ferrule. And again, 1/2 inch at the at the place on the ferrule where the bristles come out of the brush, and you'll have yourself a nice big round brush. This will hold both a lot of water and a lot of paint, and if you're working at a large scale, or you're simply working in an area that needs a big wash with a lot of water on it, this is the brush you're going to want to use for that. So you'll want those two for sure. And perhaps you're going to want a smaller round. This one is by Holbein. It's a Holbein Gold, and they say this is a number 10. But this size brush, I have another one this size. It's a little more than 1/8 of an inch. It's not quite a quarter. This can be an 8 in some manufacturers, a 6 in some manufacturers. So again, just take a look at the ferrule. You'll get something that's, you know, smaller than that, but not by a whole lot. And then you've got yourself a smaller round for some of those smaller areas and marks that you might be making. If you're going to get flats, and actually I recommend that you do, I tend to paint myself only with round brushes, but I do keep flat brushes with me. This is a 1-inch wide flat. And it's very good, actually, particular things, actually getting a really square corner, for instance, on a building, very good at that. It does carry a lot of water, so it'll put down a lot of water in a wash when you're looking to do that in a larger area of the painting. And then I have this, which is a 1/4 inch flat, so it's 1/4 inch wide, where this one is a 1 inch wide at the ferrule. Both of these are nylon brushes. Nylon brushes are fine. Better quality ones are better. If, again, you look at the materials list, I've got some very specific recommendations about that. But you're going to want probably one of each of these two kinds of brushes. And then lastly, really for some detail work, and that's about all you'll need, the detail work actually in signing your name at the end of the painting, you're going to want one of these, which is it's called a rigger. Very thin brush, but it has long bristles, and it's great for particular kinds of marks, especially things like weeds at the edge of a road or twigs coming off of a branch of a tree. Very good for that sort of thing. Also good for signing your name, so you'll want it for that reason too. I don't even, this is an older brush. I can't tell even who manufactured. Oh, yes, I can. Low Cornell, it says on the side. It's a nylon brush. It's white nylon. This says it's a number 4, so it's a very skinny little brush. And anything about that size with these long bristles will work just fine in terms of brushes. And again, take a look at that materials list and you'll see really exactly what it is that you need in terms of brushes and get specific recommendations. So let's go next actually to the paper, and we'll talk about what you should get and what you should be learning on in terms of paper. The next item that you absolutely have to have if you're going to paint in watercolor is something to paint on, and in watercolor that is generally paper. So I have a few pieces of paper out here, but it's actually all the same paper. It comes, particularly if you're starting out, it comes in a bewildering variety. There are all kinds of manufacturers. It comes in all kinds of grades, from very professional paper, which is what this is, to some student grade paper, and actually some paper that's not even as good as student grade. When you start out painting, as with your paint, you really want to work with a professional grade paper. There are many manufacturers that make professional grade paper, and it's hard to go wrong with it. But there's one in particular that I recommend because it really is easy to learn on. That paper is Arches 140-pound cold press paper, and this is on that materials list that you can download. The reason that I recommend this one is that it's, compared to most of the other papers that are out there, it's fairly absorbent, meaning that when you are using all that water, particularly in the beginning stages of a painting, which is what I recommend, and as you watch these videos you're going to see me do that, and you're going to see me talk about that over and over and over again. When you're using all that water, you really need to have a paper that's going to help you manage all that water a little bit, and Arches paper does that very well. Let me step back. Arches 140-pound cold press paper does that very well, and it's the one paper I recommend. Really, if you're starting out, I highly recommend it. And even if you've got some experience with painting in watercolor, if you haven't been using Arches 140-pound cold press, perhaps because it's a little expensive, and it is, you should really get some and try it, because you're going to find that it works differently probably than anything else that you've been working on, and again is going to help you out in your painting. I've got what's really amounts to a 1/4 sheet here, and what that means is that, and this is a half sheet, watercolor paper is sold in what's called full sheets. A full sheet of watercolor paper is 22 inches wide by 30 inches long. And this is actually half of that. This is actually 15 by 22. It's in those large sheets, it's actually as cheap as you can find it. And then once you have that, you can tear or cut it down into smaller sheets, something like a half sheet here or this quarter sheet that I have right here. Once you have the paper, the other thing you really need is something to mount that paper on. So you're going to need some sort of board to either clip your paper to, like I have here. So this is just, I haven't started painting on it, but I often paint on a piece of watercolor paper just like this. I don't stretch it, I just put it on, I clip it at the corners. During my painting, as it tends to buckle a little bit, I'll pull it out at the edge and reclamp it, try to tighten it down a little bit. But the board that I use is something called gator board. This is a very thin, you can see this one's well used, but it's a very thin, about a quarter-inch, I said thin, it's a quarter-inch thick, essentially a foam core board that's made out of plastic material so that it doesn't warp once it gets water on it. Regular foam core board will warp unless you either seal it up with a lacquer or somehow seal it with tape or something like that. But this board does not warp. And again, it's very sturdy, but it's also very, very light, makes it easy to carry around. You can also, and I clip my paper to the boards, but you can also stretch the paper, and take a look for my video on stretching paper if you want to know how to do this. But you can also stretch your paper by either taping it down. That's what this is, taped down at the edges with artist tape. You can also make that stretch, ensure that that stretch stays really, really taut by putting, stretching it out and putting staples at the edges. You can do that. And if you do that once in a while in the studio or at home and have some boards ready to go, you can just pick them up and carry them out the door with you when you're ready to leave. So we've taken a look at all the materials that you have to have when you're going to be painting in watercolor. And now let's take a look at a few other things that will really help you out in your painting. Now, beyond those things like paint and palette and paper and brushes that you have to have when you're going to paint in watercolor, there's some other things that you probably should have because they'll make your painting experience a little bit better. One of the things I was going to say are, in addition to your necessary materials, are water containers, but they're probably necessary. You certainly have to have something to put water in. It isn't necessary to have two. I like to use two, one that gets pretty dirty, as you can see, and one where the water stays fairly clean, allows me to get clean water when I need it for lighter colors perhaps later in the painting. And so that's why I like to use two containers. The other thing is I use a lot of rags. I generally have a couple rags laying right next to my water and near my palette. It allows me to blot brushes out really quickly and easily without really having to think about it. And I usually have another one that's either near the water and palette or up on my easel, so that I've got that available to sort of manually blot a brush when I really want to get it out, get it dry for certain kinds of marks, dry brush work, dry and wet work. I can do that, and so I usually have an extra one out to do that as well. Before you paint on your watercolor paper, there's a good chance you're going to want to draw on the paper first, which means you need pencils. They're not a big deal. They're generally not an expensive item, but what you pick might make a little bit of a difference. I like to use 2B drawing pencils. That's what this is. The 2Bs are a little bit softer, so it kind of helps you avoid making marks, scoring marks in the watercolor paper that don't essentially stay behind or create some sort of strange mark in your shapes. So I like to use 2B drawing pencils. If you're using pencils at all, you're probably going to use erasers as well. I have two different kinds of erasers here. I've got a white plastic eraser. Generally they're white. I've seen them actually in other colors, but they're generally white. They're good for erasing marks off of watercolor paper. The other kind that's really popular both for watercolor work as well as just drawing is a kneaded eraser, and that's what this is. This one's already been used, but they're usually in a wrapped in a little package about an inch square, and they're generally gray like this one is, and you can knead them into very thin shapes if you need to get a very sort of fine edge out of a mark that you're trying to erase on your paper. They also, by kneading them, the pencil marks that are already there, the graphite that's already on the eraser, tends to disappear, so you don't end up smudging the paper, whether it's drawing paper or watercolor paper. I have found that the white plastic erasers will smudge, and the kneaded erasers tend to not do that. And then really lastly, you're probably going to want to have at least one sketchbook, perhaps two. I have, actually I've got many sketchbooks, but I always carry with me a pencil sketchbook, one that's really meant only for pencil drawings. And I use that to work out compositions before I put them on the paper and start to paint those compositions. So you'll probably want to have one of these. It'll certainly help save some time and effort and maybe some frustration when you're painting. And the other thing is I have sketchbooks that are really meant for color, like this one. So I can work out color compositions if I want to, or I can use it for sketching, perhaps sketching scenes like this one. I happen to be outdoors. This was some years ago actually, but I happened to be outdoors and I saw a scene on a hill that I thought might make a nice painting, and I did a quick color sketch of it while I was out there in the car. So anyway, those are the materials. That wraps it up. Those are the materials that really aren't necessary, but are really helpful to have when you're painting in watercolor. Again, you can download the suggested materials list from the website and take it with you to the store, or go online with it and figure out exactly what it is that you want to purchase for painting in watercolor. And good luck, and keep painting.